Hello! We have picked up some new listeners, which is awesome. Australia, Canada, USA, Germany, Ireland, and the UK. Some of you may not have come from an RPG background and have asked some questions about why there are rules and the colour references, and just in general why it differs from a traditional radio play. I'll try to answer some of these questions. This is a role-playing game, or RPG for short. There is one person in charge, the Game Master, and my players jokingly refer to me in the game as a god. The GM is everything and everyone that the players are not. They are responsible for moving the story along. They describe what the players see, hear, and smell. They control the non-player characters that the players will run into, friends and enemies, and everything in between. The players usually control only one character. That character is made with rules that are designed to give interesting choices and yet be balanced and fair to everyone in the game. RPGs are a narrative game. There is a story that unfolds. They can be one-off games or, like our Shadowrun series, a connected expanding group of stories which is called a campaign. The GM is the only one who knows the whole story until the very end. The players will learn as they play and as the story unfolds, much the same way as a movie or book would. The difference this time is that they are directly involved in storytelling. They make decisions that affect the path of their character and the game. The players do not have a script, it's all improv. They need to decide what they say and what they do in the moment. This makes RPGs one of the simplest games to play and also one of the most complex. They build upon humanity's natural desire to tell stories, as well as community. The stories might be formed by the GM who needs to know where the overall direction and key elements of the plot will lay, but in a good group it is the players that drive the story. This shared storytelling, much like sitting around a campfire, is a key element of RPGs. The character's backstory or history, their motivations, past and present decisions, and relationships all affect the setting they play in. The character is a role the player takes on, in much the same way as an actor does on the stage or a movie. They choose their name, species, occupation, and class being a profession. The skill that they will be good at. They work out a history and motivations. What is it the character wants? How do they feel about different issues in their fellow party members? At its best, an RPG can be a theatre with rules. Each session is like a TV episode. It progresses the story. Key elements the GM has prepared may happen which will have the players reacting to them. These can be as simple as a contact calling with a piece of information or something large, like that they have been framed for the murder of a city official. Each new scene moves the story and the character's involvement shapes the outcome and the direction. But it's a game, right? Games must have rules. And indeed, RPGs do. Some have vast amount of rules, others are a bit simpler. Our playstyle leans towards a rules-light style of play. The rules are there to create a fair playing field. Different races have different strengths and abilities. They also have different weaknesses, and the rules are there to balance it all out. The dice are there to add uncertainty, anticipation, and to also remove a level of stress for the GM. Without them, they would have to decide the outcome of actions. Over time, having to make those decisions and being fair would be a difficult thing to do. Most RPGs use dice, though they can be different types and used in different ways, but the overall concept is similar regardless. In our case, we're using a game system called Genesys. It is built around success, failure, advantage, disadvantage, and triumph, despair. The dice used are colour-coded, and that is what you are hearing when we are discussing the colours. The dice are broken into positive dice and complication dice. The positive dice are ability dice. This is a reflection of your natural ability, no training or external factors, your natural dexterity, intelligence, charisma, strength, and so on. These dice are green. If you've been trained in a skill, then they are proficiency dice, which have a greater chance of a positive outcome. These are yellow. If there is a situational positive, having a grappling hook and rope when climbing, then a blue can be added. Some tasks are mundane and do not require a roll, but if there is a chance of failure that might affect the story, then a roll is used. To reflect the chance of failure or difficulties, there are complication die. To reflect difficulty, there are purple die. These mirror the green ones, but have failures and disadvantages rather than success advantages. The more difficult the task, the more purple die are added. If a task has real risk, hacking into a very secure facility, driving at speed through a street with other cars, these have a greater chance of failure, and the die include despair, which is a critical failure. Something bad has happened. These dice are red. Just like the blue situational die, there is a negative one. These die can be used for situational elements. There is ice on the ground and a character is trying to move over it, climbing a wall which is slippery, stealthing across a pathway which has dry leaves on it. This is a setback die, and it is black. To make a roll, the die pool is formed. The player looks at the skill or ability and makes that pool from that. For example, yellow and 2 greens. They then ask for the difficulty. Standard tasks are 2 purple, but if there is a situational that warrants a black is added. So they would roll 1 yellow, 2 green, 2 purple, and a black. Success and failure, and advantage and disadvantages all will cancel each other out. So what they are left with that is not cancelled out is the outcome of the task or situation. The player then uses that information to describe what they are doing and how it played out. The setting we are playing in is Shadowrun. The game started back in the 1980s with one of my favourite game companies, FASA. They have long been gone though. But some of their properties like Battletech and Shadowrun have ended up with other companies. At its core, Shadowrun is a cyberpunk setting. These settings, as cool as they are to play in, are really a warning of a near future if things go wrong. And sadly, we are getting things wrong. Cyberpunk deals in extremes, but those extremes are predictions and questions we were meant to examine. A massive part of the genre is technology, how it is used and our reliance upon it. This was some hoopy thinking back in the 1980s, but today, with the massive increase in tech in our homes and the huge addiction to cell phones, some of these issues are getting closer. Another common thread is massive corporations that basically run the countries and are a central theme of many cyberpunk stories. The old Max Headroom TV series did an excellent job on this front, as did Blade Runner. They have tremendous control over people's lives. Abuses of power, overdependence and addiction to technologies and the internet and inequality are central themes. They can take different forms. A lot of cyberpunk settings have augmentation. This is the replacement of our bodies or adding things to them. Common ones are data jacks so that we can access data much faster, internal communication to access text and calls without ever having to touch a phone, replacement arms, heart, lungs. In a focus on these elements, then the question often becomes what is it to be human? What makes us human, and what do we do to lose it? Some forms can involve the downloading of our consciousness and the ability to transfer it to other bodies. Ghost in the Shell does this with the transference between brain cases, and a lot of Ghost in the Shell involves identity. Altered Carbon can see the transference into another human body, called resleeving. The rich could afford clones of themselves. The poor would get whatever their insurance covered. A 5-year-old girl might get resleeved into a 50-year-old man's body. The show was brutal in its question of immortality and how cheap human life is in a society of true inequality can be, as well as massive questions about how we see identity. These elements are all part of the Shadowrun setting. Technology is new and retro. You might find a high-tech port on the side of someone's head that allows them to download data straight to their brain, but also an old-style typewriter hooked up to an online communication device. A mix of old and new, much like you find in Blade Runner, and, to some degree, the Fifth Element. It's often raining and dark. This is to give a sense of grim bleakness. It is not a world devoid of hope, however, but it is a world that was allowed over decades to deteriorate. Housing prices skyrocketed and became unattainable to the average citizen. More and more power was handed to corporations and the erosion of the self accelerated. The quest for that feedback loop of more likes and of self-esteem being measured by the amount of social media attention one gets, of activists and corporations trying to manipulate the youth for their own dark purposes left them husks. The players, as Shadowrunners, are in part course correctors. Much of the time, their characters do not know that they are doing so, but in trying to survive in the dark near future and working in the shadows, they are often opposed to those that have done society harm, and are actively working against them. The heroes in this case are criminals, thieves, hackers, hired muscle. A theme of our Shadowrun is community, a collection of damaged souls coming together at the local club cornerstones, where they are accepted and look out for one another. It is important when doing dark games that not everything of light is lost. Shadowrun added one unique element which set it apart and was brilliant. It added fantasy elements to the otherwise sci-fi setting. What had a very real chance of failing terribly ended up making the game stand out. Our game differs from the core of the setting. However, it's still a great setting and worth checking out. In what was called The Awakening, magic, both light and dark, returned to our world and changed things forever. Not only were there mages who could cast spells and bend reality, but those in touch with nature like the Native Americans saw a return of the druids and shamans, with magic saw a drastic change to society. Not just power bases, but many old and long dead races returned. Orcs, goblins, elves, dwarves, banshees, the undead, trolls, fairies, and dragons, amongst others. This addition of fantasy races and magic changes the cyberpunk setting in very real ways that makes Shadowrun its own game. I hope this explains some of what we are doing and makes the journey easier to follow. We all appreciate greatly that you have taken the time to listen to our games and hope that you have found some enjoyment in them. Like Bill and Ted, two of our greatest thinkers, said, be excellent to each other. Shadowrun, a slice of life adventure in a dystopian future, starring Becca as Terry the Mage, Raven Insane as Cypher the Hacker, Emily as Ren the Thief, Sarah as the Banshee Marla, and Ghost as the GM. The excellent Shadowrun is produced by Catalyst Game Labs. The Genesis rule set comes from Fantasy Flight Games, and many of the sounds and music comes from Sirenscape, which is an amazing tool for bringing more life to your game table. This has been a Kritfayle production.